Begin reading The Countess, I want to give you a quick spoiler warning. This story is set toward the end of Right Up Succession, and it basically gives away the majority of the ending of the story. If you would like to not be spoiled before you finish the book, I would wait until you finished it before you give the story a listen. If you need a copy of the book, I will have links where you can get either a signed paperback or the ebook down below. That said, let's get on to the story. The Countess by A.B. England. She stood out from the crowd because of her coloring. Until the day she came to Riant, Samuel had only ever seen one other person with red hair. It was one of the first things that drew him to her. When they'd spoken during Landry and Maya's wedding, Chantal had seemed shy and more than a little sheltered. He only learned the truth of it once the battle for Timbar Flats was underway. He'd reported to Eli's office for his shift as always, only to be informed of the force sent to retrieve Count Rollick for trial and the new role he was appointed to fill. Samuel left for Timbar within a couple of hours of his new king's return. The sight of a singed and bedraggled Landry weeping in silence as he carried his unconscious and bloodied queen is one he doubted he'd ever forget. He expected to find carnage inside the fallen castle. Such things were inevitable when diplomacy failed and negotiations were handled at the end of a sword. He'd heard murmurings about a prodigious weapon capable of tearing through a dragon's wing with one blow, but he thought it hyperbole until he'd seen the crumbled towers. Several officers from Riant's forces and a few civilians met him at the gates. He listened to their damage and status reports as they led him toward the master's study. He felt odd having an assistant trailing behind and taking notes of everything he said. Just yesterday he'd been the assistant, and the swift status change made Samuel feel off balance. The toll was historic. Dakar had seen its share of battles over the centuries, but none like this. He looked out over the northern battlements and shuddered. No wonder their ancestors had forbidden such weapons long before the crash. Samuel followed a nurse through the halls toward the overflowing infirmary. The exhausted young woman had waited until all the other reports were given before delivering hers and asking him to come with her. Until she'd mentioned Chantal, he hadn't dreamed the girl would have any part in the siege of Timbar Castle. He saw her the moment they entered the huge bustling room. Her bright hair stood out in stark contrast to the white bandages wrapped around her head and much of her face. She lay quiet and still, dwarfed by a bed designed to hold soldiers. Looking down at her now, she looked younger than Samuel knew she had to be. She was too tall and carried herself too well to be younger than 16 or 17. Still, what were Eli and Landry thinking, having a child guide a squadron into battle? Chantal stirred, mumbling something as she blinked unfocused eyes. "Lay still," Samuel admonished in a soothing voice. He laid his hand on her uninjured arm. "I need to help," Chantal slurred. It was obvious she was only half awake, but she struggled to sit up anyway. "And you will," Samuel said. "But first you have to heal."